The following is an article from the Reformed Presbyterian, Volume 2, published in August of 1838, entitled The Waldenses, and this is a continuation of an earlier article about the Waldenses. After the departure of the Earl of Toulouse, the army of the Crusaders, now consisting of 100,000 men, turned their arms against the subjects of Raymond Roger, and seemed resolved to be satisfied with nothing less than the destruction of him and all the Waldenses that peopled his dominions. This intrepid young nobleman, persuaded by the righteousness of his cause, had prepared for a valiant resistance. In his territories there were several cities fortified both by nature and art, the chief of which were Béziers, the capital, and Carcassonne. Perceiving how vain it would be to attempt resistance to the immense army of the Crusaders in the field, he shut up himself and his forces in the former, and prepared for a resolute defense. About the middle of July, the year 1209, the Popish army sat down in the neighborhood of Béziers. Notwithstanding the bravery of its lord and the determination of the citizens and soldiers, a short time served to convince them that the resistance against the superior power and number of the Crusaders would be ineffectual. What they might be unable to accomplish by force, they could by violence, and the fate of the city appeared inevitable. Foreseeing the ruin of the place, and concerned not so much for his own safety as for that of his beloved subjects, the Earl of Béziers went forth to the Pope's legate, who was with the besiegers, and earnestly supplicated him that the city might be spared, or at least that the innocent might not suffer indiscriminately with the guilty. His entreaties were disregarded, and the legate haughtily replied that he might defend himself the best he could, for he would show him no mercy. Foiled in his object, he returned to the city, and convening the inhabitants, he informed them that the only condition on which he could obtain pardon was that the Albigenses should either renounce their religion or be delivered into the hands of the Popish army. Neither he nor their Roman Catholic fellow citizens seemed to have, even for a moment, meditated compliance with the latter proposal, but they did employ some entreaty to induce the Waldenses to submit to the former. The answer returned by these sufferers for the truth's sake, when in perilous circumstances, is a noble exhibition of the heroic fortitude that characterized them, and deserves to be had in everlasting remembrance. They declared that they, quote, never could consent to purchase prolongation of the present perishing life at the price of renouncing their faith, that they were fully persuaded God could, if he pleased, protect and defend them. But they were as fully convinced that if it was his good pleasure to be glorified by the confession of their faith, it would be a high honor conferred upon them to lay down their lives for righteousness' sake, that they preferred displeasing the Pope, who could only kill their bodies, to incurring the displeasure of God, who could destroy both soul and body at once, that they hoped never to be ashamed of, nor forsake a faith by which they had been taught the knowledge of Christ and his righteousness, nor, at the hazard of eternal death, barter it for a religion which annihilated the merits of the Savior and rendered his righteousness of none effect. They therefore left it to the Roman Catholics and the Earl to make the best terms they could for themselves, but entreated that they would not promise anything in their behalf inconsistent with their duty as Christians. After this bold and manly avowal, in which the persecuted showed that, quote, they loved not their lives to the death, unquote, the Roman Catholic inhabitants consulted for their own safety by sending their bishop to the legate, requesting that, as they were untainted with heresy, they might not be included in the punishment of them that remained obstinate. Their petition, however, was refused, and scarcely had the prelate returned to the city when a general assault was ordered, and the besiegers were speedily in possession of the place. Raymond Roger, with a few followers, escaped to Carcassonne, but the rest of the people were subjected, without regard to age or condition, to the most barbarous and unrelenting slaughter. The scene of bloodshed and cruelty that followed the taking of the city remains indeed unparalleled in the annals of barbarity. In one of the churches were counted 7,000 dead bodies of the Albigenses, and in all the others a similar spectacle was exhibited. 23,000, or according to some historians, 60,000, were indiscriminately massacred, and the city was utterly destroyed by fire. Caesarius, a Roman Catholic historian, records the shocking inhumanity of the Popish army on the present occasion. When the Crusaders were about to enter the city, some of the knights inquired at Arnold, the legate, how they should distinguish the Catholics from the heretics, and expressed a desire that the former might not be included in the slaughter. To this application he instantly replied, quote, "Kill them all. The Lord will know well them that are his." The Crusaders, unsatiated with blood, next proceeded to Carcassonne, in which the Earl of Béziers had taken up his residence, and into which a great number of the persecuted had fled from the ruthless sword of their enemies. The Popish army, which had been augmented to the number of 300,000 men on the 1st of August, sat down before the city. The place was strongly fortified, and the besieged, being firm in the principles which they professed, and having before them the recent cruelties inflicted on their fellow sufferers at Béziers, were determined on a brave resistance. Successively were the assailants repulsed, with great loss. Even after they had obtained possession of one of the suburbs, they were unable to gain further advantage, and 40 days, the period for which the Crusaders had enlisted, had nearly expired, and the city remained untaken. In this emergency, the King of Aragon, who had lately joined the Crusaders, offered himself as a mediator between the contending parties, and by the authority of the legate proposed conditions of peace to Raymond Roger. These were substantially that, quote, he might himself with 12 others quit the city, and that the remainder of the citizens and troops should be abandoned to the pleasure of the Crusaders, unquote. These proposals the young nobleman resisted with indignation. Quote, "Rather," said he, "than do that the legate demands of me, I would suffer myself to be flayed alive. He shall not have the least of my company at his mercy. I am resolved both to defend myself and my subjects by every means that God has put in my power." Unquote. Acting on this heroic resolution, the Earl and his people nobly defended the place against the attacks of their enemies, and repeatedly repulsed them with considerable loss. When the legate perceived that the city was not to be easily taken, he had recourse to stratagem, and endeavored to effect by perfidy what was not to be accomplished by open and honorable warfare. By means of a gentleman who was related to him, Raymond Roger was allured from the city with only a small band of attendants, in the prospect of renewing the negotiation and obtaining peace on more honorable terms. Here he perceived, too late, his error in trusting on the professions of those whose maxim it is, quote, that faith is not to be kept with heretics or those that favor them, unquote. Refusing to give up his subjects to the butchery of the soldiers and proposing to return to the city, he was, in violation of the most solemn engagements, arrested with all his attendants, committed to the custody of Simon, Earl of Montfort, and being thrown into prison, he died soon after, not without strong suspicion of being poisoned. The perpetrators of this detestable wickedness doubtless expected that this act of treachery would strike terror into the minds of the besieged and force them to surrender at discretion. Divine Providence, however, frustrated for the time their schemes and opened a way of escape for his servants. Relief arose from another quarter. When their gallant defender was taken away, and when all human means appeared to fail, the Lord discovered how easily he can bring deliverance in a way the most unexpected. Seemingly by accident, but guided by him who is, quote, wonderful in counsel and excellent in working, unquote, some of the citizens discovered a subterraneous passage which led to the castle of Cabaret, about 3 leagues from Carcassonne. By this, during the night, they all made their escape, abandoning their riches and possessions to the will of their merciless enemy, and having arrived at the place of their destination, they dispersed themselves through various parts of the country, seeking the retreats of their brethren in the same faith, and obtaining there a temporary rest from the cruelties of their oppressors. The city which they had forsaken was abandoned to plunder, and the legate and the Crusaders, disappointed of their prey, manifested their cruelty by causing the prisoners whom they had taken, to the number of 450, to be burned alive or otherwise put to death. After the fall of Carcassonne, the Crusaders continued their work of devastation and bloodshed, and in a short time the whole province was overrun, and incredible numbers of Waldenses were cut off. So complete was the success of these privileged murderers that the provinces which had pertained to the Earl of Toulouse and his nephew were entirely conquered, and being transferred from the rightful owners were bestowed as a gift upon Simon, Earl of Montfort, a man of a cruel and perfidious disposition, but a faithful and devoted son of the Church of Rome. The cruelties of Montfort in prosecuting his religious war, as it was called, exceed belief. The Earl of Termes, who favored the Waldenses and defended for them the castle of Minerva, was taken and thrown into prison, where he soon after died. His wife, sister, and daughter, who seemed to have fully embraced the Waldensian faith, when they refused to recant, were, with several other females of distinguished rank, thrown into a large fire and consumed to ashes. When the castle was taken, a friar was appointed to preach to the inhabitants, who exhorted them to acknowledge the Pope and conform to the Church of Rome. Quote, "We will not renounce our religion," unquote, exclaimed they, interrupting him, quote, "You labor to no purpose, for neither life nor death shall induce us to abandon our profession," unquote. On this, at the instigation of the legate, 180 men and women were committed to the flames. But the time would fail to recount all the scenes of baseness, indecency, and barbarity that are detailed in the history of this war against the witnesses of Jesus, directly by Innocent III and his successors in the popedom. Suffice it to say that the blood of the Waldenses was shed in torrents, and that everywhere cruelties the most revolting to humanity were committed on the unoffending people of God. At length this first crusade terminated towards the close of the year 1209 by a treaty agreed upon for a few weeks between Simon, Earl of Montfort, and the Count of Faux, who, from a sense of justice and humanity, had espoused the quarrel of the Waldenses.